They hauled him from his car and piled on spurious charges until he finally unveiled his true identity. In the late hours of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the streets lay nearly empty, broken only by the distant murmur of traffic lights shifting from crimson to emerald. Jamal Winslow, a veteran assistant U.S. attorney, had only just departed a dinner with colleagues. His thoughts were of home, not of work, injustice, or looming court battles, until a sight of flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror halted him. With a resigned exhale, he signaled, slowed, and reached for his wallet. He wasn't speeding, nor had he missed a signal. There was no valid reason for this stop, yet he knew all too well that such encounters rarely hinged on mere technicalities. Two officers advanced to his window. Officer Kyle Driscoll, towering, broad-shouldered, his hair cut in a strict military style, positioned himself at the driver's side, while Officer Brent Kessler, lean yet equally imposing, hovered by the passenger door. License and registration, Driscoll demanded in clipped tones. Jamal handed over his documents. "May I ask why I was stopped?" he inquired. Driscoll shot a brief glance at Kessler before replying, "Your taillights are out." Jamal's brow furrowed. He knew that was false. His car had just passed inspection, and the mirror's reflection confirmed his brake lights were in perfect working order. "Are you absolutely certain?" Jamal asked evenly. Driscoll's expression flickered as he leaned in and stepped out of the vehicle, and a slow tension coiled through Jamal's limbs. He had prosecuted cases where a routine stop spiraled into something far darker. His instincts urged him to comply, yet his experience warned that these officers were already fanning the flames. "I'm not stepping out until you explain why," he declared. Kessler smirked, his hand resting confidently on his belt, "Because we said so." Jamal drew a deep breath. He knew the law inside and out, having spent years studying, enforcing, and defending it. He also knew he wasn't obliged to exit his vehicle without probable cause. "I'm within my rights to ask why I must leave my car," he maintained. Then, Driscoll's patience snapped. He yanked open the door. "Step out now," he ordered. Before Jamal could react, Driscoll seized his wrist, wrenching him forward as the seatbelt dug harshly into his chest and shoulder. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jamal barked, instinctively pulling back. Driscoll offered no explanation, only a tighter grip. In seconds, Kessler was on the opposite side, twisting Jamal's arm behind his back so that cold, biting cuffs clamped onto his skin. "You're resisting," Driscoll stated icily. Jamal stared in disbelief as Kessler forced him against the hood of his own car. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a seething rage. This was no spontaneous mishap, it was a contrived trap, or rigged game in which they believed they had already won, even as they teetered on the edge of a grave miscalculation. Inside the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse, the courtroom teemed with activity. The air was thick with the rustle of clerks shuffling papers, the occasional cough, and the soft hum of whispered conversations, yet beneath it all, another tension simmered. Jamal Winslow sat rigidly at the defense table, today not as an attorney, but as the accused. Facing charges of resisting arrest, obstruction, and disorderly conduct, fabrications through and through, he understood that in this arena, truth mattered less than what could be proven. At the front, Judge Margaret Holloway, in her mid-60s, surveyed the room from the bench. Her presence exuded an unyielding authority, whether earned or innate, and her reputation for dismissing nonsense was evident in the way she scarcely deigned to glance at Jamal. That look told him everything about the road ahead. Prosecutor Richard Calloway strode in with the confidence of a man certain the odds were stacked in his favor. He adjusted his tie with deliberate precision and nodded to the officers seated proudly at the witness stand. Jamal watched as Driscoll and Kessler sat with self-satisfied expressions, buoyed by the full weight of the system behind them. "Your Honor," Calloway began, "this is a straightforward case of an individual turning a routine traffic stop into a physical altercation with law enforcement." Jamal exhaled slowly, the arrogance and sheer audacity of such claims simmering within him. Calloway continued, flipping through his notes. "The defendant refused to comply with officers' lawful orders, became aggressive, and had to be restrained for everyone's safety." At that moment, Jamal's attorney, Thomas Rivera, a beleaguered and underpaid public defender, leaped from his chair. Objection! There is absolutely no evidence that my client was aggressive. Judge Holloway dismissed the objection with a curt wave. Overruled. Jamal's jaw tightened. That rebuttal was startlingly swift. Rivera sighed but pressed on. Your Honor, the officers escalated the situation without just cause. There's no body cam footage of my client acting aggressively, simply, no such footage exists. Calloway smirked. Body cams were not operational at the time, but the officers' statements speak for themselves. Jamal nearly laughed at the absurdity. How convenient that an officer's word alone would suffice. Driscoll took the stand first, reciting his well-rehearsed lines. The defendant was combative from the start, refused to exit the vehicle, raised his voice, and created a hostile environment. Every word was a lie. Kessler then nodded in agreement and added, he tensed up. We feared for our safety and had no choice but to restrain him. More lies. Under the table, Jamal's fingers curled into fists. He had dedicated his career to fighting such blatant corruption, and now he was living it firsthand. Judge Holloway's impatience was barely concealed as she directed a look at Jamal's lawyer. Anything else, Mr. Rivera? She prompted. Rivera hesitated, fully aware of the judge's ironclad reputation and her indifference to pleas for fairness, yet he swallowed hard and continued, Yes, Your Honor, the defense calls Jamal Winslow to the stand. This was the moment. As Jamal rose and approached the witness stand, he felt every pair of eyes fixed upon him, watching, judging, waiting for him to crack. Yet he remained unbroken, for what was about to unfold would alter everything. Sitting in the witness chair, Jamal exhaled slowly as the court clerk administered the oath. His hands lay lightly in his lap, though inside a storm of simmering indignation raged. He wasn't there simply to defend himself, he was there to expose the truth. Prosecutor Calloway stepped forward, pacing with an unnecessary flourish of confidence. Mr. Winslow, would you say that you complied with the officer's instructions during your traffic stop? He asked. Jamal met his gaze calmly and replied, I asked why I was being ordered out of my car, that in itself is not illegal. Calloway let out a faint sigh. So you refused to exit? He pressed. I asked why I was compelled to step out, a request I am legally entitled to question, Jamal reiterated. Calloway smirked as he glanced at the jury, as if Jamal's intelligence were a mere inconvenience, and after issuing several commands, added, and yet you still did not comply. Jamal maintained his steady stare. There was simply no lawful basis for such an order. Calloway then turned to the judge, shaking his head as if nothing unexpected had occurred. Your Honor, it is evident that the defendant, Jamal, leaned forward, his voice unwavering even before Calloway could finish. I must disclose something. A sudden silence fell. Calloway hesitated, and for the first time, Judge Holloway truly regarded him. Slowly, Jamal reached into his briefcase, his lawyer Rivera tensed, uncertain of the unfolding events. Gradually, Jamal extracted his badge, a small, unassuming rectangle that had, in an instant, become the most dangerous object in the courtroom. I'm Jamal Winslow, he announced, his voice slicing through the mounting tension like a razor. Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. The room froze. Judge Holloway's lips parted ever so slightly, her gavel poised ominously on the desk yet remaining motionless. The officer stiffened, Kessler's leg trembled beneath the table, Driscoll's jaw clenched, and Calloway's face drained of color. Excuse me, Jamal said, tilting his head, did I stutter? The atmosphere shifted dramatically, the jury leaned in, the stenographer paused mid-typing, and even Rivera looked as though struck by a freight train. You're a federal prosecutor, Calloway managed to say, his voice wavering. Jamal then lifted his ID, isn't that exactly what this says? And in that breathtaking moment, the entire case imploded. Judge Holloway reclined, her mouth pressed into a thin, determined line. She knew that if she ruled against Jamal now, if she dismissed his testimony and sided with these officers, it wouldn't be just another forgotten case, but a full-blown scandal. The courtroom had transformed from a mere arena into a ticking time bomb, and Jamal had ignited its fuse. The very air seemed to hold its breath. Her grip on the gavel tightened, though she refrained from slamming it down, not yet, as she calculated her next move. This was no routine matter, it was a career-shattering debacle waiting in the wings. Calloway gulped, his smooth arrogance evaporating, and turned toward the officers. For the first time, both Driscoll and Kessler revealed a trace of nervousness. Jamal sat, silently witnessing the scramble for control, a scene he'd seen countless times in boardrooms, hushed back-office meetings, and whispered conversations among prosecutors when a doomed case landed on their desk. But now, he was the one forcing their hand. I wasn't aware of this information, Calloway stammered, rifling through his files as if searching for an escape. Your Honor, before he could continue, Judge Holloway raised her hand, silencing him for the first time, her eyes locking onto Jamal's. His very presence now posed a formidable threat, a government prosecutor, wrongfully arrested, assaulted, and misrepresented, whose suffering had long been ignored, one who might have easily remained a nameless statistic. Turning to the officers, she addressed them, Driscoll, Kessler, and both sat up straight, like children awaiting a scolding. Would you care to amend your statements? She asked. There was only silence, a thin crack forming in their previously unyielding composure. Jamal could sense it, Driscoll's fingers curled tightly around his knee, and Kessler glanced at Calloway as if pleading for a lifeline. Seizing the moment, Jamal spoke first, Your Honor, I request that the court retrieve the dispatch call logs from the night of my arrest. Calloway recoiled, his face a mask of panic. Jamal was not speculating, he knew the protocols. Had the officers radioed in before the stop, their fabricated claim about the tail light would collapse. If not, they had violated procedure from the start. Judge Holloway scrutinized him for several long moments. She knew that denying his request would be tantamount to burying evidence, while granting it would drive Jamal's fate home with a final, devastating blow. Clearing her throat, she finally declared, Request granted. Driscoll exhaled sharply, his composure fracturing at last. Kessler shifted uncomfortably, jaw clenched, they both understood what was coming. Jamal leaned back in his seat, aware that his work was far from over. This case would not be contained within these walls. It began with a single reporter, a young journalist from a local Baton Rouge paper, feverishly typing away at the back of the courtroom. Within hours, the story exploded, and by morning, Jamal's name was everywhere. Assistant U.S. Attorney wrongfully arrested by Baton Rouge cops, federal prosecutor exposes corrupt officers in open court, judge under fire for bias against a black government lawyer. The internet erupted. Social media flooded with clips captured by courtroom onlookers. The instant Jamal revealed his badge became a viral sensation, spreading like wildfire. Cable news ran segments dissecting the case's implications, questioning how many others had been railroaded like Jamal, others too powerless to fight back. Yet the most profound shift took place in Baton Rouge itself. Community activists organized rallies, protesters converged outside the courthouse, demanding accountability, civil rights attorneys unearthed old cases overseen by Judge Holloway, seeking patterns of bias. Then, the decisive blow arrived, an anonymous leak of internal police records and emails, exposing officers' collusion and justifying dubious stops. Accounts from other black drivers, pulled over, falsely ticketed, and threatened with arrest if they objected, confirmed it all. This case had grown beyond Jamal Winslow. It now laid bare a hidden system operating in darkness for years, now exposed under unforgiving floodlights. But those in power would not yield without a fight. The backlash was swift and fierce. City officials scrambled, the police department issued a carefully worded statement, and Judge Holloway's office abruptly ceased returning calls. By week's end, the Baton Rouge Police Department announced an internal investigation, a gesture as superficial as it was performative, designed merely to pacify the public. Yet the pressure only built. A civil rights attorney filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of past victims, community leaders demanded Judge Holloway's removal, protesters refused to relent. Ultimately, the case was handed over to Louisiana's Attorney General for review. Later, in the quiet of his modest apartment, Jamal watched the ensuing press conference as his phone buzzed incessantly with calls from journalists, lawyers, and others who'd suffered similar injustices but lacked his badge to fight back. This was no longer mere damage control, it was a reckoning. Even Judge Holloway sensed it. When Jamal returned to court for the verdict, her demeanor had transformed. Gone was the casual indifference and overconfidence. Instead, she faced a case too monumental to bury, forced to choose between genuine justice and yet another calculated maneuver to protect the system. The courtroom fell into expectant silence as Judge Holloway cleared her throat. The weight of protests, media scrutiny, and leaked files pressed upon her shoulders, leaving her with no ideal options. Glancing at her notes, it was clear that this decision was no longer hers alone, it was the public's verdict. With a measured exhale, she set her gavel down softly. After reviewing the evidence, the court finds the defendant, she paused, then continued, not guilty. A tidal wave of relief surged through Jamal, yet he remained still, absorbing the moment. For this case was bigger than him alone. The officers sat rigidly, faces pale. Kessler's hands were clenched as his career flashed before his eyes, while Driscoll, ever the more haughty, leaned forward and began, "Your Honor, before raising a hand to stifle himself, then adding, the court will also forward all relevant materials to the state attorney's office for further review." That was the end of it. The officers would not walk away unscathed. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, gasps, and the rapid clicking of keyboards, as, for the first time, the system turned its own gaze inward. Slowly, Jamal rose, his lawyer patted his back, yet his eyes remained fixed on the officers, on Calloway, whose confident veneer had crumbled, and on the judge who had long dismissed cases like his until circumstances forced a change. Most of all, Jamal thought of those who had never been granted freedom, the countless souls who had once occupied this very seat and never seen justice. As he stepped from the courtroom, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the crowd roared, but Jamal felt no jubilation. This was not a moment of personal victory, it was irrefutable evidence, a testament to the enduring injustice that, only now with the world watching, had forced the system to react. He moved past the glaring lights and into the throng, where voices cried out for real change. The battle was far from over. In the aftermath of these revelations, one could not help but ponder, how many more hidden stories lie buried, silenced by a system that overlooks the voiceless? How many lives pass without their truths echoing in the halls of justice? Witnessing injustice was no longer enough, it had to be confronted head-on. And as the weight of accountability began to press upon those in power, the seeds of transformation took root in the collective consciousness, promising that silence would no longer reign unchallenged.